September 23rd, 1940. North Atlantic. A sea of black water and burning oil stretches endlessly beneath a pale, indifferent moon. The air tastes of metal and diesel. A cold wind claws at the waves, carrying the cries of men, hundreds of them, scattered across an ocean that has become a grave. Commander Richard Ashworth, 34 years old, stands on the bridge of HMS Cossack, a British tribal-class destroyer forged for one purpose: to hunt and kill German submarines. But tonight, that purpose is colliding with something far older than doctrine: the instinct to save human life. The clock reads 3:56 hours. Ashworth has exactly 8 minutes to decide what kind of officer, what kind of man he will be. Behind him, the troopship SS Empress of Britain burns, broken in half, her decks tilted into the sea. 900 British soldiers, survivors of the torpedo impact, fight to stay afloat in water just above freezing. Their cries are faint, fragmented by wind and distance. Ahead of Cossack, somewhere in the dark, a German U-boat, U-124, under the command of Kapitän Lieutenant Georg Wilhelm Schultz, slips beneath the surface. Her hull is leaking oil, her engines damaged, but if she escapes, she will hunt again and kill again. Ashworth's sonar operator has a solid contact, bearing 287 degrees, range 3,100 yards. The U-boat is retreating northwest, diving slowly, still within striking range. The doctrine from Admiralty Command in London is absolute: destroy the submarine first, survivors come later. The logic is brutal and mathematical. Each German U-boat destroyed means hundreds of merchantmen saved. Every U-boat that escapes means tens of thousands of tons of Allied shipping lost, and perhaps the starvation of Britain itself. Ashworth knows this. He has lived this. For 9 months, he has escorted convoys across this same ocean through fog, storms, and darkness. He has seen the aftermath: lifeboats overturned, oil-slick corpses drifting for miles, seagulls circling above the wreckage. He understands why these orders exist. But tonight, standing on the bridge as icy spray lashes his face, he also sees something the Admiralty cannot see: 900 men fighting death in plain sight, and no rescue ships anywhere near. The convoy that left Liverpool 3 days earlier has scattered after a night of chaos. Cossack is alone. The nearest destroyer, HMS Achilles, is almost an hour away. The nearest corvette, the small, slow rescue vessels designated for recovery, is out of range, 30 miles behind. Ashworth checks the chart. He knows the water temperature, 61 Fahrenheit. He knows what that means: 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in, 20 before the screaming stops. He grips the cold metal of the bridge rail. He has 8 minutes, perhaps less, to decide. Does he obey orders, turn toward the sonar contact, and destroy the German submarine? Or does he turn back toward the wreck and try to save as many men as possible before the ocean finishes what the torpedo began? Wind howls through broken radio wires. The ship's crew wait in silence for his command, every eye fixed on him. Every second spent thinking, another life lost to the water. And at that moment, amid the chaos, Ashworth realizes something chilling. The greatest danger in this war may not be the enemy ahead, but the orders behind. The sonar ping echoes again, steady, fading. Contact moving away. Decision time over. Ashworth closes his eyes for half a second. Then, quietly, he gives the order that will end his career and save hundreds of lives. Hold contact. Begin rescue operations. Engine slow. Ropes uncoil. Cossack turns toward the sinking men and into history. This moment 8 minutes in the North Atlantic would ignite one of the most debated moral questions in naval warfare. When does duty end and humanity begin? And to understand why this choice mattered, why one destroyer's defiance reshaped Royal Navy doctrine, we must go back. Back to 1940, when Britain stood alone. When the Atlantic was not a sea, but a battlefield of endurance, mathematics, and faith. In 1940, the Atlantic Ocean was not a route, it was a lifeline. Every gallon of oil, every crate of food, every rifle, every American-built aircraft crossing those waters was oxygen for Britain's survival. Lose the Atlantic, and the island would starve long before the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht arrived. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought in great sweeping clashes or cinematic explosions. It was fought in silence, beneath the waves, between unseen predators and exhausted escorts racing to protect the arteries of empire. At the start of that year, Germany's Kriegsmarine possessed fewer than 60 operational U-boats. By autumn, even that small force was sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. In June 1940 alone, over 500,000 tons of merchant shipping had been lost. Convoy after convoy vanished without trace. Britain's shipyards simply could not keep pace with the rate of destruction. To the Admiralty, the arithmetic was cold but necessary. If a U-boat could sink 10 merchant ships in its lifetime, and each ship carried enough supplies to feed and arm divisions of men, then destroying one U-boat, even at the cost of 1,000 lives, was strategically rational. It was this reasoning that shaped Admiralty Order T-1940. The directive every escort commander memorized. Primary objective, destroy enemy submarine threat. Secondary objective, ensure survival of convoy. Tertiary objective, rescue of personnel when practical. The phrase, when practical, carried enormous weight and silence. It meant that in practice, destroyers did not stop to rescue survivors. Their job was not mercy, but mathematics. The Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command, headquartered in Liverpool, had turned the Atlantic into a grid of priorities. Escort destroyers were assigned to attack. Corvettes, trawlers, and converted merchant vessels, slower, less armed, were assigned to pick up survivors after the danger had passed. It was a system designed for efficiency and survival of the whole. But the ocean cared nothing for systems. When convoys scattered under night attack, when fog or radio silence cut communications, or when weather separated escorts from the fleet, doctrine met reality. And reality was chaos. Between January and September 1940, German U-boats sank more than 430 Allied ships. Tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers went into the sea. Very few came back out. The Royal Navy's internal estimates were brutal. For every U-boat destroyed, an average of 375 Allied seamen are lost. That equation, loss measured against destruction, became the invisible law of the Atlantic. A law that would shape men like Richard Ashworth long before that September morning. Ashworth himself was not new to command. He had served on destroyers since the Spanish Civil War, learning the merciless rhythm of convoy escort duty. Endless gray horizons, sonar pings, coded transmissions, and the constant knowledge that at any moment the sea beneath could explode. He had seen friends die from depth-charge counterattacks gone wrong. He had seen men rescued, only to die of cold minutes later. To him, orders were not words. They were survival structures. Doctrine kept chaos in check. Doctrine saved convoys. Doctrine was the reason Britain could still breathe. But as the war deepened, So did the cost. By mid-1940, intelligence from Bletchley Park, the early decryption center, showed that Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat arm, had begun shifting tactics to wolf pack formations. Groups of submarines, coordinated by radio, would attack at night, on the surface, striking from multiple directions before slipping beneath the waves. The convoys were designed to protect against single submarines. They were never built to withstand a coordinated pack. Each successful wolf pack strike multiplied pressure on commanders like Ashworth. Every decision, whether to break formation, pursue, or rescue, carried strategic consequences measured in tons of lost shipping and human lives. The men in London calculated these outcomes in reports and charts. The men at sea lived them. It was this world, cold, mathematical, merciless, that shaped the doctrine Ashworth carried into that September night. And it was this same world that would demand he decide in minutes whether to obey it or defy it. Because the orders made sense on paper, but the ocean had other. The Empress of Britain was not just another ship. She was a symbol, a relic of pre-war luxury repurposed for war's grim logistics. Once the pride of Canadian Pacific steamships, a vessel that had carried the wealthy across the Atlantic in silk and champagne, now stripped of opulence, painted gray, and crammed with British troops headed for the colonies. On September 23, 1940, she carried over 900 soldiers and 56 crewmen bound for Freetown, Sierra Leone, a critical stopover for forces being repositioned to defend West Africa's Atlantic ports. The convoy's code name was WS-5A, part of the Winston Specials, fast troop convoys organized personally under Churchill's directive. These ships represented Britain's effort to hold its empire together while Germany tightened its stranglehold on Europe. The mission was simple in outline, impossible in execution. Cross nearly 2,000 miles of open ocean, the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth, with minimal escort and no air cover. That last detail mattered most. By 1940, long-range aircraft capable of patrolling the mid-Atlantic, the so-called Black Pit, did not yet exist. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, that would later bridge that gap, was still months from operational deployment. This meant there was a vast dead zone, hundreds of miles across, where Allied ships were completely vulnerable. And that is precisely where the Empress of Britain sailed. At the time of the attack, the convoy had been scattered by a violent Atlantic squall. Waves reached 25 feet, wind speeds hit 40 knots, and visibility dropped to less than half a mile. In such conditions, maintaining tight convoy formation was suicidal. One misjudged wave could mean collision and destruction. So the ships spread out, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. It was a necessary measure, and a fatal one. Because silence works both ways. The Royal Navy couldn't hear its own ships, but the Germans could. Under the command of Kapitänleutnant Georg Wilhelm Schultz, the German submarine U-124 was prowling the mid-Atlantic hunting ground west of Dakar. U-124 had already established a reputation. It had sunk 4 merchant ships in the past month, totaling over 30,000 tons. Schultz's crew was experienced, efficient, and utterly ruthless. They were one of Dönitz's elite gray wolves. When Schultz's hydrophone operator picked up propeller cavitation from the scattered convoy, it was all the invitation he needed. No sonar, no escort cover, and no air reconnaissance. Perfect hunting conditions. At 3:47 hours, the U-124's torpedo officer launched a single G7E electric torpedo from Tube 1. Range, 2,500 meters. Target, Empress of Britain. The weapon was silent, no visible wake, no bubble trail. It struck amidships, detonating in the engine room. The blast ripped through bulkheads, killed dozens instantly, and plunged the ship into darkness. Steam erupted from ruptured pipes. Fuel oil spilled across the surface like ink. Within seconds, the liner began to list heavily to port. The crew tried to launch lifeboats, but the angle was already too steep. Miles away, the destroyer HMS Cossack, under Commander Richard Ashworth, caught the flash on the horizon. He knew instantly what it meant. A torpedo hit at night could only mean one thing: a U-boat strike. But what Ashworth didn't know was that his destroyer was alone. The rest of the convoy, and the ships designated for rescue, had scattered east during the storm. The nearest destroyer, HMS Achilles, was over 40 minutes away at flank speed. There were no corvettes, no trawlers, no secondary escorts. Only the Cossack, her sonar operator, and the growing number of men now thrashing in the freezing Atlantic. Ashworth's first report to Western Approaches Command went unanswered. Atmospheric conditions had jammed his transmitter. He had no orders, no guidance, only doctrine. Doctrine told him to pursue the submarine. Doctrine told him to let others handle the survivors. Doctrine told him to think strategically, not emotionally. But the ocean had other priorities. When the Cossack reached the wreck site, the scene before him wasn't numbers on a page. It was hundreds of men, oil-soaked and terrified, crying out in the dark, their voices vanishing under the wind. The ship was breaking apart, one half already sliding beneath the waves. This was not strategy. This was survival, naked, desperate, immediate. And it was here, in the raw blackness of that night, that Richard Ashworth's war truly began. The torpedo had struck one ship, but it had detonated something far deeper inside him. At 3:54 hours, the destroyer HMS Cossack reached the scene. The sea was on fire. A slick of burning oil spread across the black surface, glowing orange beneath the rain. Ashworth's binoculars showed lifeboats overturned, rafts half-inflated, men clinging to debris in every direction. The Empress of Britain, now broken in two, groaned as steel tore under pressure. Her bow already pointed downward. Her stern was rising. In the chaos, Ashworth's sonar operator, Sub-Lieutenant Raymond Ellison, 22 years old, voice trembling, called out through the intercom, "Sir, solid Aztec contact, bearing 287, range 2,400 yards. Submerging, definitely a Type 666. That single report was the sound of military logic snapping back into place. Ashworth didn't need to think. Every reflex, every bit of Royal Navy training kicked in. Doctrine said, U-boats take priority. Destroyers attack immediately. Rescue ships follow behind. But there were no rescue ships. No follow behind. Just one destroyer, one submarine, and hundreds of men already dying. The seconds began to count down. 8 minutes. That was the window in which he had to decide. If he chose to engage the U-boat immediately, U-124 would almost certainly be destroyed. A major victory, one less predator stalking the Atlantic lanes. But in the time it took to chase and depth charge, 900 men would die. If he chose to stay and rescue, the U-boat would escape, live to sink other ships, maybe kill hundreds later. This was not a tactical choice. It was a moral equation written in human lives. One submarine versus 900 soldiers. One order versus one conscience. One man against the mathematics of war. To understand the weight of Ashworth's choice, we need to understand the system that created it. By late 1940, the Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle of ships. It was a battle of numbers.
Britain was losing merchant tonnage faster than it could be built.
The Admiralty's policy, signed and reinforced by the first Sea Lord, stated,
Escort vessels shall not break pursuit of enemy submarines for the purpose of rescue.
Anti-submarine action is of primary importance. The reasoning was cold but logical. Destroying one submarine could save dozens of convoys. Stopping to rescue a few hundred men might cost thousands later. It was strategy reduced to calculus. Each U-boat worth roughly 300,000 tons of merchant shipping over its operational lifetime. Each convoy represented food, ammunition, or fuel for Britain's survival. To disobey this logic was to defy not only orders, but the mathematics of war itself.
Ashworth knew all this.
He had signed the orders himself. He had seen the briefings, the charts, the grim statistics. He understood that the entire naval war hinged on a brutal exchange rate, lives for tonnage. And yet when he saw those men in the water, numbers stopped making sense. The human calculation. The water temperature that night was 61 Fahrenheit, or 16 degrees Celsius, cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes. Medical studies later confirmed 10 minutes. Loss of dexterity, 15 minutes. Disorientation, 20 minutes. Unconsciousness, 30 minutes. Death. At the time Ashworth arrived, most of the soldiers had already been in the water for 12 minutes. He had maybe 8 minutes to act, either to begin rescuing or to begin hunting. One way or another, he had 8 minutes to decide who lived and who died. The ASDIC operator's voice crackled again. Contact steady. Bearing 288. Range increasing. Sub is damaged, leaking oil. Ashworth gripped the bridge railing. The U-boat was limping, easy prey, a hunter bleeding in the dark. But so were the men. He could see their faces illuminated by burning fuel oil. He could hear them, voices in every direction, shouting names, prayers, orders that no longer mattered. He turned to his first officer, Lieutenant David Hartley, who simply asked, "Sir, what are your orders?" Ashworth said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "We start rescue. Maintain contact as long as possible. 8 minutes. Then we hunt." The decision seemed small, 8 minutes of compassion, but it was everything. Those 8 minutes would define the rest of his life. The rescue begins at 3:56 hours. The crew of the Cossack swung into action. Lines were thrown, cargo nets unrolled, rafts deployed. Sailors braced on the deck railings as the destroyer rolled in the heavy swell. Men were pulled aboard one by one, coughing, shivering, eyes wide with shock. By 3:58, 22 rescued. By 4 o'clock, 47. By 4:02, 68. Every second brought more to safety, and every second the U-boat slipped further away. At 4:04, the Empress of Britain's final bulkhead gave way. The ship groaned, rolled completely to port, and disappeared beneath the waves in a massive roar of collapsing air and steel. Hundreds of men, still clinging to the hull, were swallowed in seconds. "Sir," the sonar operator called out, panic in his voice. "Contact fading. Range 4,800 yards, dropping fast." Hartley looked at his captain. "Sir, if we're to pursue, it has to be now." Ashworth stared out over the sea, the oil fires, the men, the debris field stretching for hundreds of yards. He thought of the doctrine. He thought of the signatures in the Admiralty office, of London men in clean uniforms making cold equations. And he thought of the faces right in front of him, freezing, crying, clinging to life. He made his second decision. We stay. At 4:07 hours, contact lost. The U-boat escaped into the depths. The hunt was over. But the rescue The real battle had just begun.
This was the moment that redefined not just one man's career, but an entire Navy's doctrine. The 8 minutes he had given the survivors became the turning point between rulebook war and human war. On 0410 hours, the North Atlantic had gone eerily silent. The burning oil slick still glowed faintly across the waves, like a horizon of liquid fire. Men drifted between floating wreckage and half-sunk rafts. Some still called out, voices thin, breaking against the wind. Others were silent, faces turned toward the dawn that would never come for them. The HMS Cossack circled the debris field slowly, her searchlights sweeping in white arcs. Each beam revealed brief glimpses, a face, an arm, a shattered lifeboat, and then nothing. The sea was turning red with diesel and blood. Ashworth's men worked mechanically, hands numb, uniforms soaked in salt water and oil. They pulled survivors aboard using ropes, boat hooks, whatever they could reach. The deck became a chaos of bodies, shivering, vomiting, gasping for air. Some cried softly. Others stared blankly, as if already halfway gone. The destroyer's surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Lionel Fraser, moved between them, whispering encouragement, pouring brandy, applying blankets. He would later write in his report, most men suffered severe hypothermia. A few had burns from oil ignition. All showed signs of acute shock, the look of those who have seen hell and cannot yet believe they are still alive. The weight of each life. By 4:45, the crew had rescued 137 survivors. By 5:20, 208. Every lift from the water slowed them down. Every new survivor meant more weight, less room, more chaos. A destroyer was now dangerously overloaded, a ship built for 190 men carrying over 400 souls. Some of the crew began to question in whispers if a U-boat was still nearby, and sonar could not confirm. They were now a perfect target. The destroyer, engines slowed, lights exposed, decks crowded with men, a floating beacon of vulnerability. Ashworth knew it. He knew he was risking not only his ship, but every man aboard, but he did not stop. When his first officer reported, "Captain, we're at capacity. The decks are unstable," Ashworth replied quietly, "Then find more space." He ordered every usable surface cleared, mess decks, wardrooms, corridors, even his own cabin turned into a medical bay. The destroyer became a floating refuge. The silent enemy below. At 0535, the sonar operator called out again, "Possible contact, bearing 141, range 1 mile." The bridge went cold. Every man froze. It was the same U-boat, or another drawn by the wreck. Ashworth turned off all floodlights immediately. The ship vanished into darkness. Only the faint glow from oil fires on the water remained. For 12 minutes, the destroyer waited, engines dead silent, drifting among bodies and wreckage. Every sound felt like betrayal. The scrape of a boot, the cough of a freezing man, the creak of metal. Down below, the survivors huddled together, unaware of the silent hunter moving beneath them. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared into the black water. The sonar contact faded slowly. Either the U-boat slipped away or it was never there. They would never know. At 0547, Ashworth gave the order to resume rescue. No one spoke, but every man on that bridge knew how close they had come to annihilation. Dawn over the Atlantic. By 6:10, the eastern horizon turned pale gray. The fires on the sea began to dim. The storm eased slightly, leaving a thin mist on the surface. Out of the gloom, the first light of dawn revealed what the night had hidden: the full devastation. Hundreds of bodies floated in the water, motionless. Most still wore life jackets, but they were beyond saving. The survivors they'd pulled aboard stared at them quietly, whispering names. When the sun finally rose, HMS Cossack had rescued 254 men. The rest, over 300 souls, were gone. Ashworth stood on the bridge, unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon. He had broken orders. He had lost the U-boat. He had saved 254 lives, and yet he felt no triumph. In his private logbook, later recovered by the Admiralty inquiry, he wrote only one sentence that morning. "We saved what we could. The sea took the rest." The journey home. The return to port was slow, deliberate. The destroyer's decks were a makeshift hospital. Blankets, stretchers, steaming kettles, and the constant sound of coughing. Men slept in corridors, curled on cold metal, some hallucinating from shock. The doctor and his team moved continuously, checking pulses, pouring hot broth, whispering encouragement. Some survivors died even after being rescued, their bodies too cold, their hearts too weak to restart. By the time they reached Greenock, on the Scottish coast, 22 had died aboard ship. They were buried the next morning in a temporary cemetery overlooking the Firth of Clyde. No ceremony, no flags. Just simple wooden crosses, washed by rain. Ashworth attended every burial, standing at attention in silence. His men said they had never seen him cry before. That day, he did. The Admiralty responds. Within 72 hours, London sent orders. Ashworth was to report immediately to Naval Command, Liverpool, for debriefing. Officially, it was a routine evaluation. Unofficially, it was an inquiry. He had disobeyed combat doctrine. He had allowed a U-boat to escape. He had risked a destroyer for survivors of a ship that was already lost. The inquiry was held behind closed doors. 3 admirals, 2 intelligence officers, and 1 weary destroyer captain standing before them. For 2 hours they questioned him, why he broke formation, why he stayed beyond operational safety limits, why he ignored the order to prioritize the hunt. Ashworth's reply was simple: because they were alive. No one spoke after that. He was formally reprimanded, but not removed from command. Officially, the Admiralty labeled it a commendable act of humanity inconsistent with standard anti-submarine protocol. Unofficially, he was a quiet hero. The men he saved called him the captain who chose men over orders. This was not just an act of mercy. It was the moment the Royal Navy began questioning its own doctrine. The war had forced logic to dominate compassion, but one man had proved that sometimes survival of the soul mattered as much as survival of the fleet. When Commander Richard Ashworth returned to the port at Greenock, the newspapers hailed him as a hero. They printed headlines like, "Destroyer saves hundreds after Atlantic attack," "Courage under fire," "Captain defies orders to rescue men." But inside the Admiralty, the tone was colder, polite, professional, surgical. His official file bore 3 short words in red ink: "Violated standing orders." It was the kind of note that followed a man forever in the Navy. The quiet after the applause. For the first week, the survivors sent letters. Dozens of them. From soldiers, from wives, from mothers. All saying the same thing. "Thank you for saving my husband. Thank you for giving us back our son." Ashworth read every one. He placed them neatly in a wooden box beside his bunk. Then, as the weeks passed, he stopped opening new letters, because with every thank you, he also saw the faces of the 109 who hadn't been saved, the men who slipped from ropes, the ones pulled up lifeless, the ones still drifting somewhere under the gray Atlantic. And always, the same question returned: was it worth it? He had saved 791, but in doing so, a damaged German U-boat escaped, returned to base, and within weeks sank 3 more ships, killing 47 more seamen. The Admiralty inquiry made sure he knew those numbers. They recited them line by line, as if the dead could be balanced on a scale. In the Navy War College in London, strategists debated Ashworth's decision as a case study. One colonel wrote, "Commander Ashworth's actions were operationally unsound, but morally justifiable." However, moral justification cannot sustain naval strategy. They treated it as a theoretical exercise, a lesson in command discretion. But for Ashworth, it wasn't theory. It was the sound of men screaming through oil-thick water. He once told a fellow officer during debriefing, "Doctrine doesn't see faces. I did." That quote, unofficially recorded in a clerk's notes, was later removed from the official transcript. When historians examined Ashworth's private log in 1954, they found a second section hidden behind the regular reports. His personal reflections written in code, later deciphered by naval archivists. It began with one line, "Every order is written by men far from the sound of drowning." He described the smell of the sea that night, diesel, iron, and something like death. He detailed the moment he realized the U-boat had escaped, and how, for weeks after, he woke at 04:07 every morning, hearing the sonar ping fade. He wrote, "The sound of that contact fading felt like the sound of a man slipping beneath the waves." For years, he carried that sound with him. In early 1941, after the inquiry, Ashworth was reassigned to shore duty, training new officers in convoy defense tactics. He spoke rarely of the Empress of Britain.
To the young recruits, he appeared strict, distant, even cold. But one trainee remembered seeing him stare out to sea for long stretches, whispering to himself. When asked once what he thought about the war, Ashworth replied quietly, "The war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when the screaming fades." That line was written on his gravestone years later. By mid-1942, the stress had taken a toll. He collapsed during a training exercise. Medical notes from the time refer to exhaustion and persistent nightmares. Modern historians would call it PTSD, though in 1942 it was simply called battle fatigue. Even then, he refused to resign. He said, "If I leave, it means the sea wins." In November 1940, largely because of Ashworth's case, the Admiralty revised its anti-submarine warfare orders. The new clause read, "In the absence of designated rescue vessels, the commanding officer may exercise discretion to conduct rescue operations when the number of survivors exceeds 200 and conditions permit." It became known as Admiralty Order 47D, and it saved thousands of lives in the later years of the Atlantic Campaign. But Ashworth never mentioned it. When a colleague congratulated him years later, he simply said, "It shouldn't take a man losing his career for others to find their humanity." Every September 23rd, the anniversary of the attack, more letters arrived, from the men he saved, from their families, from their children. They sent photographs of weddings, babies, family picnics. In one, a child had written in crayon, "Thank you for saving my daddy." Ashworth never replied, but he kept every letter. When he died in 1979, his family found 791 letters carefully stored in a wooden box. One for each life he saved. By the end of his life, historians saw Ashworth as the embodiment of the moral tension of modern warfare, the moment when procedure collides with conscience. Doctrine said, "Pursue the enemy." Ashworth said, "Save the living." He was reprimanded for defying orders, yet the Navy rewrote those very orders because of him. He became proof that sometimes the most important victories aren't measured in tonnage sunk or ships saved,
but in the lives pulled from cold water because one man refused to obey a heartless equation. The summons October 3rd, 1940. 10 days after the rescue. The telegram arrived, stamped urgent, Western Approaches Command. Commander Richard Ashworth was to report to the Admiralty Board in London for inquiry into his actions on September 23rd. He knew what that meant. It was not a commendation. It was a trial. He packed his dress uniform, sealed his ship's log, and left HMS Cossack moored at Plymouth Harbor. The men saluted as he departed, a silent salute that said more than any words could. They knew what was coming. They also knew that 791 men were alive because of him. The inquiry convened inside Admiralty House, Whitehall. The room smelled of paper, ink, and cold coffee, the bureaucracy of war. 3 admirals presided behind a long oak table. Ashworth stood alone before them, his cap tucked under his arm. The charges were read aloud in a detached monotone. Failure to engage enemy submarine per standing orders of Anti-Submarine Command. Neglect of strategic duty resulting in escape of hostile vessel U-124. No mention of the 791 lives saved. The prosecution began with charts and maps. They demonstrated how, by pursuing the submarine immediately, Ashworth could have intercepted U-124 at approximately 3,800 yards, the ideal range for depth charge deployment. Instead, he had delayed 11 minutes. By then, the U-boat had slipped beneath the thermal layer, lost forever to sonar. Their conclusion was mathematical, merciless. 11 minutes of hesitation, 3 merchant ships sunk later, 47 lives lost. Direct consequence. Ashworth listened silently. His defense. When his turn came, he didn't read from notes. He stood straight, his voice steady. The standing orders presume the existence of designated rescue vessels. On September 23rd, none were present. The doctrine assumes mathematics can replace judgment. But when assumptions collapse, orders require interpretation. I interpreted them to mean saving those who could be saved. He didn't plead for sympathy. He didn't justify himself with emotion. He simply described the reality, the oil on the waves, the sound of screaming, the count of men in the water. At one point, an admiral interrupted. "Commander, are you aware your decision allowed U-124 to escape?" Ashworth replied, "Yes, sir. I was also aware that leaving would have condemned 761 men to die within the hour." There was silence. Then the questioning resumed, clinical, procedural, devoid of compassion. They closed with a single chart showing tonnage sunk by U-boats between July and October 1940. The line was steep. The admiral at the center of the tribunal tapped it with a pencil. "Commander Ashworth, this is the war you are fighting. One submarine equals thousands of tons of shipping. We cannot win by saving soldiers, while letting submarines escape." "Understood, sir, but we also cannot win if we forget why those soldiers are worth saving." The tribunal adjourned for 6 days. On October 9th, 1940, the verdict was delivered. Commander Richard Ashworth, found guilty of violating standing orders of the Admiralty, reprimanded and relieved of sea command. However, the board recognizes the exceptional circumstances of the engagement and the humanity displayed under duress. Recommendation: standing orders to be revised to include officer discretion under absence of rescue vessels. It was both condemnation and vindication. A career ended and a doctrine changed. Ashworth saluted the board, turned, and walked out. He never commanded a warship again. Within 2 months, a new clause, Admiralty Instruction 47B, was circulated to all convoy escorts, for the first time in Royal Navy history. Officers were authorized to prioritize human rescue over enemy pursuit when immediate rescue assets were unavailable. This single paragraph, hidden deep in operational manuals, became the quiet legacy of one man's defiance. It would save untold thousands in the brutal years ahead. When Ashworth's former first officer read the circular, he reportedly said only, "He lost his ship, but he saved our souls." After the trial, Ashworth was reassigned to Naval Tactical School, Portsmouth, instructing new officers in convoy defense. His lectures were technical, methodical, but beneath the precision was something deeper. He often told his cadets, "When you look through the periscope, remember, war is fought by humans, not by charts." He never spoke of Empress of Britain, not once in public.
But among sailors, the story spread quietly, told in mess halls, passed through generations, the captain who chose men over orders. To some, he was a hero, to others, a cautionary tale. To history, he became something in between, a man who stood between conscience and command, and paid the price. By 1943, U-124, the same submarine that escaped that night, was sunk by HMS Black Swan and Stonecrop. Every German sailor aboard perished. Ashworth never commented when he heard the news. He simply wrote one line in his log: "The sea keeps its own accounts." The Atlantic campaign turned decisively in the Allies' favor later that year. Improved sonar, air cover, and convoy tactics reduced merchant losses dramatically. But buried within every updated manual, in fine print beneath the diagrams and procedures, was that line: "Officer discretion permitted when rescue exceeds capacity." That was Ashworth's fingerprint on history. After the inquiry, Ashworth's naval career quietly dissolved. He was reassigned to shore duty at the Naval Tactical Evaluation Department in Portsmouth. No more open seas, no bridge commands, no engines roaring beneath him. Just files, charts, and the endless hum of bureaucracy. Every day, he passed younger officers headed to the front. They saluted respectfully, but never mentioned the incident. Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. The war had little patience for moral complexity. In the Royal Navy of 1941, results were measured in U-boats destroyed, not lives saved. Ashworth had achieved the latter, and lost the former. But the silence wasn't shame, it was reflection. He carried the memory of that night like ballast, heavy, but necessary to stay upright. He wrote in his private notebook, never intended for publication, "The hardest part of command is not giving orders, it's living with the ones you gave." The 791 survivors of the Empress of Britain were scattered across regiments. Many went on to fight in North Africa, Burma, and Italy. Dozens never returned home, but hundreds did, and they never forgot the night a destroyer turned back for them. Letters began arriving months later, some addressed simply, "To the captain who pulled us from the Atlantic." They came from men in hospitals, from wives of rescued soldiers, from children who hadn't been born yet. Ashworth kept every one in a small wooden box marked September 23rd. One letter from 1942 read, "Sir, I never saw your face that night, only the ropes dropping from your ship. I remember grabbing one and feeling it pull me up through the freezing water. Every birthday since, I think of that rope." Another came from a mother in 1943. "My son, Private Robert Hall, wrote that you saved him. He was later killed in Italy, but please know that because of you, we had 2 more years with him. For that, I am forever in your debt." Ashworth never replied, but he read them often, especially on the anniversary. The amendment to the Admiralty's Standing Orders, Instruction 47B, became a template for future operations. It was invoked multiple times between 1941 and 1945, when convoy escorts faced the same dilemma: attack or rescue. In nearly every instance where discretion was used,
Survival rates improved without significant loss in U-boat engagements. Ashworth's decision, once condemned as insubordination, had effectively redefined morality in command. A classified report issued by the Royal Navy Tactical Division in 1944 acknowledged incidents where discretion was exercised under revised standing orders have demonstrated improved humanitarian outcomes without measurable compromise to strategic objectives. That was bureaucratic language for something simpler. Ashworth had been right. When the war ended in 1945, Britain celebrated victory, but the oceans remained graveyards. The Atlantic was littered with wrecks and memories. Ashworth retired from the Royal Navy in 1946 with the honorary rank of captain. He declined public recognition, refused interviews, and lived quietly in Devon. He fished, he gardened, he read naval histories, and in the margins, he made quiet annotations correcting the official record. On the anniversary of the rescue each year, he would visit a small seaside chapel and light a candle, not for the 791 who lived, but for the 109 who didn't. He never viewed the event as a triumph. To him, it was a night of failure mitigated only by human decency. When asked once, in private, if he regretted the decision, Ashworth replied, "Regret? No. But I do wish the world understood that saving lives isn't defiance. It's the reason we go to sea in the first place." In 1963, more than 20 years later, a group of former soldiers who had been rescued that night formed the Empress of Britain Survivors Association. They located Ashworth through naval records and invited him to their first reunion in London. He hesitated to attend. He believed they'd forgotten him, or worse, blamed him for not saving more. But when he arrived, older, his uniform replaced by a modest gray suit, the entire room stood in silence. Then one of the men saluted and said, "Welcome home, sir. We've been waiting 23 years to buy you a drink." They toasted until midnight, telling stories of that night, not the terror, but the small acts of courage. Sailors diving into oil-covered waves, men lifting strangers into safety, the single light on Cossack's deck guiding them through darkness. Every year after that, Ashworth attended the reunion without fail. He sat quietly, listening, smiling rarely but deeply. By the late 1970s, Ashworth's health had begun to fail. He was 73 when he attended his last reunion in 1979. He gave a short, halting speech that was recorded on tape, the only surviving audio of his voice. He said, "I've spent most of my life wondering if those 8 minutes were the right choice. History may never care. But you, the men who lived, you are my answer. Every one of you is a chapter that might never have been written." 2 months later, on November 4th, 1979, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, 412 men from the Empress of Britain Rescue stood as an honor guard. They carried their old regimental banners, faded and frayed, and saluted one final time. The Royal Navy's official record of the incident contained only one sentence: "Rescue of 791 survivors, conducted under adverse conditions, demonstrated exceptional seamanship." No mention of disobedience, no mention of courage, no mention of 8 minutes that changed doctrine forever. But the men remembered, and they made sure their children did too. Today, naval academies, from Dartmouth to Annapolis, still teach the Ashworth dilemma as a case study in command ethics. It asks a question without an easy answer. When duty and humanity conflict, which do you serve? Most cadets answer with theory, with tactics, with statistics. Then, the instructor reads the final line from Ashworth's notebook, written years after the war. "The sea does not remember the orders we followed, only the lives we saved or lost." And the room always falls silent. History often remembers the loudest victories,
But sometimes it's the quiet defiance. The choice made in silence on a cold Atlantic night. That shifts the course of human behavior. Commander Ashworth's decision to rescue the survivors of the Empress of Britain was buried in naval archives for decades. The Admiralty never promoted him beyond honorary rank. His name appeared only once in official correspondence, and even then, it was redacted in later public releases. But his act rippled through unseen channels.
Young officers who had served under him carried his story forward, retelling it in mess halls, classrooms, and briefing rooms. They didn't quote doctrine. They quoted the man. He stopped for men when everyone else would have steamed ahead. That sentence, whispered, retold, reshaped, became the foundation for a new kind of leadership, one measured not by aggression, but by humanity under pressure. In 1951, the Royal Navy introduced the Admiralty Code of Operational Ethics, a policy influenced heavily by internal post-war assessments of command failures and moral lapses. Buried in that document was Clause 4B, stating, when immediate adherence to orders would directly endanger the survivability of Allied personnel, and when situational command authority deems otherwise, captains may exercise humanitarian discretion,
provided justification is documented. Though the clause was never publicly attributed, its origins traced back to a confidential 1946 memo referencing the Cossack rescue. Naval historians now identify that memo as the direct descendant of Ashworth's act. What he did wasn't defiance. It was the first modern assertion of ethical autonomy in warfare, a principle that would eventually shape NATO's rules of engagement, ROE, and later, United Nations peacekeeping operations. By the mid-1950s, American naval officers studying at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, began referencing British case studies on command ethics. Among them, the Atlantic Rescue Incident, September 1940. Rear Admiral James Holloway, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, once cited it in a 1958 lecture. The measure of an officer isn't how precisely he obeys orders, but how wisely he disobeys them when the situation demands. That philosophy was directly inspired by the Ashworth case study. By the 1960s, this principle had crossed into air warfare, submarine command, and NATO crisis doctrine. When a modern-day naval captain decides whether to break pursuit to rescue a civilian vessel, the ethical foundation guiding that moment traces its lineage to Ashworth's Bridge. In 1982, during the Falklands War, British task force commanders faced a hauntingly similar dilemma. During the sinking of the Sir Galahad, naval commanders had to choose between pursuing Argentine aircraft or rescuing burning men in the water. The decision to prioritize rescue and the commendations that followed were based on Admiralty guidelines first informed by Ashworth's case, though never publicly acknowledged. Senior staff in the Royal Navy's historical branch later confirmed that the ethical structure of those orders could be traced back to revisions made after 1941. In essence, every life saved in that South Atlantic inferno carried the quiet legacy of a man who had refused to abandon 791 souls decades earlier. The Ashworth Principle, as naval ethicists now unofficially call it, rests on three tenets: command autonomy in moral conflict, the authority to act in contradiction to standing orders when those orders violate the moral imperative to preserve life. Human-centric warfare. The recognition that warfare is not only a contest of weapons, but a test of conscience, historical accountability. The idea that history will not remember who fired first, but who chose not to let others drown. Though no official doctrine bears his name,
These principles have quietly informed military ethics programs in over 12 nations, from the United Kingdom and Canada to Japan and the United States. At the Britannia Royal Naval College, cadets are still required to analyze ethical case studies in leadership courses. One of those cases, though stripped of names, describes a commander in the North Atlantic who risked insubordination to save hundreds of lives. Cadets are asked, was he right? The discussion often divides the room. Half argue that orders exist for a reason. The other half, usually those with combat family histories, say that humanity must override hierarchy. It is in this debate that Ashworth lives on, not as a statue, not as a line in a textbook, but as a question, a mirror reflecting every commander's soul when faced with impossible choices. In 2004, naval historian Dr. Eleanor Haversham discovered Ashworth's personal logbook in a Devon estate sale. Inside were hundreds of handwritten pages detailing the night of the rescue, every order, every hesitation, every casualty count.
A final page bore a simple line, "If I am judged for this, let it be by those who lived." Haversham published her findings in the Journal of Maritime Ethics, calling Ashworth's story the most important forgotten act of moral courage in 20th century naval warfare. Her work reignited interest in his decision, leading to posthumous recognition within academic and military circles. By 2010, the Royal Navy had quietly restored Ashworth's name to the official war registry, under Commendation for Humanitarian Leadership. Ashworth's decision reached beyond the uniform. Civilian maritime law, humanitarian rescue protocols, and even Coast Guard ethics began referencing commander discretion clauses. The International Maritime Organization, IMO, later embedded this principle in its global rescue framework. Every shipmaster has an obligation to render assistance to persons in distress at sea, regardless of standing orders or operational objectives. That single sentence, adopted in 1979, was written in the same year Ashworth died. Almost poetically, the world finally caught up to the morality he had lived by 40 years earlier. Today, there are no monuments for Commander Harold Ashworth, no bust in Portsmouth, no museum display, but his legacy doesn't need marble. It lives in the decisions made on every ocean, every night, when a radar screen blinks and a captain must choose between orders and humanity. In those moments, the quiet ones, Ashworth's voice echoes across the decades. Orders end, but duty never does. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of immortality a soldier can earn. In 2004, Dr. Eleanor Haversham didn't realize what she had found when she purchased a weathered sea chest from a small antique shop in Devon. The chest was marked only with a faded brass plate, R. Ashworth, HMS Cossack, 1940. Inside were uniform fragments, a rusted compass, and a small leather-bound diary wrapped in oilcloth. The first page simply read, "If you are reading this, then my silence has lasted long enough." Over the next 120 pages, the diary revealed not just the tactical thinking of a wartime officer, but the soul of a man torn between obedience and empathy. It contained precise times, crew names, weather logs, but also deeply personal reflections on leadership, morality, and guilt. What emerged wasn't a hero's confession. It was a study in human conscience under duress. Ashworth's diary begins weeks after his court-martial. He had been reassigned to shore duty at Devonport, stripped of command, but not dismissed from service. He wrote, "I walk the docks, and the sea mocks me. The men still salute, but I see the question in their eyes. Would you do it again? I would, 1,000 times yes." He continued, "They called it dereliction. I call it duty, not to admiralty, but to the lives before me. I know the mathematics, I know the doctrine, but numbers have never drowned. Men have.
For a man once described as precise to the point of severity, these words were shockingly raw. He wrestled not with regret, but with the realization that institutional obedience had limits, and that those limits were defined not by law, but by humanity itself. Later entries reveal Ashworth's evolving worldview, shaped by the isolation of shore duty and the haunting echoes of the men he saved. One passage reads, "The sea is the truest judge of men. It punishes arrogance and rewards mercy. Orders are written by those who have never heard a drowning man scream. I have." And that sound rewrites every rule. He began lecturing younger officers informally, often on moral leadership and decision-making under pressure. His sessions weren't sanctioned, but attendance grew. A former midshipman, Thomas Lyle, later recalled, "Ashworth didn't teach tactics. He taught conscience. He said a man's command isn't measured in kills, but in who he brings home." Tucked between diary pages was a folded, yellowed letter addressed to First Sea Lord, confidential, not for dispatch. It appears Ashworth never mailed it. Here's an excerpt. "My decision was not made against orders, but beyond them. Doctrine must serve men, not the reverse. If you wish to court-martial me again, so be it. But know that one day, another commander will face the same choice I did, and if your rules remain unchanged, more men will die for the sake of paper." The letter ends abruptly with a single underlined phrase. "The enemy is not always the one who fires torpedoes." That sentence, cryptic yet powerful, has since become a key line in naval ethics lectures across the world. Despite his conviction that he did the right thing, Ashworth was never free from the numbers. Every diary entry for the next decade begins with a count: 791 saved, 109 lost. Every year, on September 23rd, he would visit a small church overlooking the sea in Devon and place a wreath marked with those numbers. Local residents often saw him standing alone, staring into the horizon for hours. In one of his final diary entries from 1968, he wrote, "They told me I saved 791. They don't understand. I lost 109, and I still see their faces every night." This wasn't guilt, it was ownership. He carried those 109 souls with him, not as regret, but as a reminder of the cost of every moral choice. Historians analyzing Ashworth's diary have identified three major insights that redefine what it means to lead in war. Moral clarity is never instant. True ethical decisions aren't made in comfort, they're forged in chaos. Ashworth didn't have the luxury of reflection when he made his choice. He acted, knowing that the verdict would come later. Empathy is a form of strategy. To see the humanity in one's men isn't weakness, it's foresight. A leader who values lives understands the long-term morale and unity that emerge from compassion. Doctrine without humanity is suicide. Blind obedience breeds destruction. Every effective military leader since Ashworth, from submarine commanders to Air Force generals, now studies this lesson in some form. Commander Richard Ashworth died in 1979 at age 73. He lived modestly in Plymouth, teaching navigation and seamanship to local cadets. His obituary was 2 sentences long. No mention of the Empress of Britain. No recognition of the lives he saved, but at his funeral, something remarkable happened. 412 men, survivors of that cold September night, stood in formation in silence. Many of them brought their children and grandchildren. They didn't speak. They simply saluted as his casket passed, draped not in the Union Jack, but in the naval ensign of HMS Cossack. Among them was one of the men he had pulled from the sea, who said quietly to a reporter, "We were his last command, and he never left us behind." Inside his sea chest, beneath the diary,
was one final scrap of paper. Written in fading ink, "Obedience builds navies, conscience saves lives. May those who come after me never confuse the two." That single line, just 10 words, has since been engraved on a small brass plaque at the Royal Navy Museum in Portsmouth, mounted anonymously under the title,
Words from an unknown commander, but the curators know exactly who wrote them. When Admiral T revised standing orders in November 1940, it was a small procedural note, barely 3 sentences long. But those 3 sentences have echoed across every modern naval operation since. Today, they are studied not as tactical doctrine, but as ethical precedent. Every time a commander must choose between orders and lives, the Ashworth Clause, as it's now unofficially called, becomes relevant again. The lesson wasn't about torpedoes, submarines, or rescue ships. It was about something deeper, the point where duty collides with decency. In 1982, during the Falklands War, Royal Navy officers found themselves facing eerily familiar decisions. When HMS Sheffield was struck by an Exocet missile, commanders of nearby ships had to choose between pursuing the Argentine aircraft that fired the missile or rescuing survivors from the burning destroyer. The tactical manuals said pursue. The moral instinct said rescue. Captain John Coward of HMS Brilliant later admitted in an interview, "The doctrine still favored counterattack, but I thought of Ashworth that day. I thought of what it means to leave men in the water. He chose rescue. Because of that decision, 225 sailors from Sheffield survived. The parallels weren't lost on anyone inside the Admiralty. The same impossible decision, separated by 42 years, and the same quiet defiance of cold arithmetic. Military strategists have a term for this type of conflict, the Ashworth paradox. It describes a situation where the immediate tactical victory directly contradicts the long-term moral objective of a war. Destroying one more enemy can save ships. Saving one more man can save morale. But both cannot be done at once. This paradox remains unsolved. No algorithm, no artificial intelligence, no command simulation has ever been able to quantify conscience. And so, the decision still falls to the individual. The man or woman who stands on the bridge, the cockpit, or the field, and has seconds to choose between what is right and what is required. In 2003, during the Iraq War, British and American officers faced an evolution of the same moral equation. Urban warfare created new forms of collateral damage. Commanders began to revisit the Ashworth case, now through the lens of modern ethics training. Major General Jonathan Shaw once remarked, "Ashworth's ghost still sits in every briefing room." His choice reminds us that leadership isn't just about victory. It's about who we become in the process. In counterinsurgency warfare, civilian safety often competes with mission success. Every drone strike, every bombardment plan carries an echo of Ashworth's night in the Atlantic when saving the living meant letting the enemy go. Even in today's wars, Ukraine, the Red Sea, and beyond, the same moral calculus endures. Satellite command and AI-assisted targeting make decisions faster, but they don't make them easier. In interviews with Ukrainian naval officers in 2023, some admitted to studying Royal Navy case studies from the Second World War, including Ashworth's. One captain, speaking anonymously, said, "When a drone swarm is approaching and you can intercept or rescue your own wounded, you remember stories like his. They tell you that sometimes the greater victory is not killing the enemy, but not losing yourself." His words echo the same truth that haunted Ashworth for decades. Rules keep armies disciplined. Conscience keeps them human. At the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, a module titled Ethics of Command Decision-Making now opens with a case study titled The Ashworth Decision, When Orders Fail Reality. Cadets are asked a single question. If you were Commander Ashworth, 900 men in the water, one enemy submarine within reach, what do you do? No two answers are the same. Some argue for doctrine, the greater good. Others argue for compassion, the human good. And the instructors remind them, both can be right, because Ashworth didn't win or lose that night. He simply chose. And in that choice, he defined what military leadership really means. In 2010, the Royal Navy quietly placed a small memorial plaque aboard HMS Dauntless, one of its new Type 45 destroyers. It reads, "In memory of those who chose rescue over pursuit. May courage always include compassion." No one outside the service ever heard about it, but for those who serve, it's a silent reminder that every radar contact, every sonar ping, every command order carries with it a moral shadow.
A ghost from 1940, whispering, "You have 8 minutes. Choose wisely."
War reveals both the best and worst of humanity. It exposes how fragile our moral lines can be, and how powerful a single act of mercy can become. Commander Richard Ashworth never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who did his job, a job that required breaking the very rules he swore to follow. But in doing so, he proved something timeless. Victory without humanity is just survival. And sometimes, survival alone is not enough. In war, some men chase enemies. Others save souls. History remembers both, but honors the latter. If this story moved you, if you believe leadership is more than obedience, then subscribe to Tales of Valor. Because every week, we bring you the forgotten decisions that shaped history. The moments when courage wasn't about firing a weapon, but holding on to humanity.
The Pacific Inferno, the Japanese officer who burned his own orders. Another story of duty, defiance, and the fragile line between honor and humanity. Click on the screen now to continue your journey through the hidden truths of World War II. Let history speak through the choices that changed it.